Welcome to A Growing Concern. One issue we talk a lot about on this program is water. We've mentioned various times that there's like a billion people on the planet that don't have adequate water supply, that water is going to be probably more fights over water in the next 50 years than there is over oil right now, which is pretty scary. It's an issue that's going to be becoming more and more in the political sites as time goes on. And here in Oregon, we're unique. We have plenty, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the planet or the rest of the country has plenty. And there's talk about refugees coming to this state, and there's actually some folks, some citizens, and some politicians that are becoming aware of that, and they want to do something about it now, you know, before things get out of hand. There's going to be a water conference addressing those issues this weekend, and I have a couple of guests that are going to talk about this. We have Nancy Price, who is here from the national organization Alliance for Democracy, of which there is a chapter here in town, and we also have Karen Mitzner, who's a local activist on many issues with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And we're going to discuss this issue. We're going to go back and forth about this conference that's happening. There's a little bit of it going on tonight, which is obviously, if you're watching this, you're not going to be able to check that out. But it's going on from 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon with various panels, and we'll discuss some of that as we go. But welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you for having us.
All right, you bet. And this was set up by David Delk, who is, I don't know, he might be the president or the director or whatever of the local Alliance for Democracy channel, democracy program, and he's also works with the group out in Tualatin Valley that's been doing the water forum. It's actually it's morphed into the water spot now, and along with Nancy Matella. But we'll just get going here. Nancy, you've been here. You're up here from Sacramento area.
Yeah. Well, I live in Davis.
And you're with that national organization, Alliance for Democracy.
Yeah,
Now, is that specifically water issues, or?
Well, no, we deal with a range of issues. Our sort of mission is to look at the issues of corporate rule, corporate power, and to sort of try to dismantle that nexus of corporate rule and establish a kind of a democracy that truly meets the needs of people. And the chapter here, led by David Delk, is one of our most active and chapters with more members and more activities going on all the time that he and Nancy and others sort of shepherd along.
Well,
we do, however, have a national Defending Water for Life campaign, and so and we have activities in a number of states around that issue of water. In it, yeah.
I see. Well, I was talking to Karen on the phone there, and we were talking about water. What exactly is the situation with water? I mean, in this country, we have areas like Oregon here that has some on one side, and then we have, you know, like the other side is low on water. What exactly is the danger? I know we talked about the Oglala aquifer that is being drawn down. Is there really a danger that people will be migrating because of this issue?
Well, that Ogallala Reservoir, it's being withdrawn from 14 times more than it's being replenished. So it's a big one, and it underlies 8 states. That doesn't mean it has an area that's the same size as all 8 states, but it just gives you an idea of how extensive it is. It means that we have to become a lot more conscious about how we farm in particular, and how we use water in general. Industry uses a lot of water. Farming uses an awful lot of water. In our state, about 86% of the water that we use goes to farming. So we're not out of danger just because, you know, we're having torrential rains right now. We have an awful dry state outside of this narrow band from the ocean to the Cascades, Jim. And the rest of the state's semi-arid and parts arid. Except for another narrow band that's way out east. And so we have to watch, we have to be careful, we have to learn how to conserve, we have to learn how to store better, and we have to learn how to retain our water reserves so that we can share them equitably amongst all people instead of privatizing what we've got and losing a whole lot to the wealthy.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned the use of water. I'm wondering, Nancy, mm-hmm. on the National Alliance for Democracy, are they aware of the abuse of water? Are they working on, because, you know, she mentioned we need water for farms. Well, there's a lot of runoff that could ruin water.
Well, we work on the issue of trying to educate people about water quantity issues. Mm-hmm. And the climate impacts on water quantity, which really has to do with sort of reshaping distribution patterns. And at the same time, which Karen was mentioning, and at the same time we deal with water quality issues, because one of the larger frames of the whole water problem internationally is advocating for water as a human right.
I was going to get to that.
Yeah,
I'm glad
right,
you brought that in right away. Yeah.
So, I mean, that means that we have to look at water quality and water quantity issues for the population overall and for nature, for the ecosystems as well. And we have tended to be part of the national and international water movements, people's water movements, but we've done a lot of work in local communities that have been involved in privatization, you know, fighting back against privatization, whether it's been bottled water or municipal privatization. So that's sort of been the scope of our work. And we started out looking at the issue of water and trade agreements is how we sort of got into the water.
Of course, right, yeah.
The water issue, and then we've branched out. And because we're a chapter-based organization, we tend to work within the communities where we have members and chapters.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned the fair trade, or actually it's not fair at all, free trade. Right. There was a country in South America that ended up national corporation went in there and somehow got a hold of their water, and they were kicked out.
That's right. Well,
and that kind of brought all that to a head, I think.
Well, it brought it. That's right. I mean, you're mentioning
Was it Bolivia?
Bolivia
yeah.
and Cochabamba, and this year was the 10th anniversary of Bechtel, the San Francisco-based corporation, right, being thrown out of Cochabamba. And that actually was a sort of paradigmatic. I mean, that was the great example of a people whose public water system was privatized. The World Bank and the IMF were forcing this kind of privatization where a public water system is taken over, the management and operation is taken over by a private corporation. What happens, of course, is rates go up, quality goes down, transparency is lost.
Access goes away.
Labor is, unions are fought against. And actually what they were going to do in Cochabamba was also charge the local people for the rainwater they were capturing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there was this huge uprising. One person was killed. There were lots of demonstrations on the street where the military and police were called out. And ultimately Bechtel left. And so that was the paradigmatic water fight, which galvanized everybody and started really the People's Water Movement.
And they sued, I don't know what ever became of that, but they sued under the WTO, I understand. I don't know what ever happened with that.
Yeah, well, what happened is that
Bechtel sued.
Bechtel, as an American corporation, the U.S. did not have a trade agreement with Bolivia.
Oh, okay.
So Bechtel used their subsidiary in the Netherlands to then lodge a complaint against Bolivia. And I believe, you know, I'm not sure. I think it was either settled for very little or abandoned. I'm not certain about the details of that.
Could I pick up the trade issue?
I was just going to bring that to you.
Yeah,
right.
I think that the trade issue is crucial, and it's one of the reasons that progressives everywhere want to get rid of the current trade laws. And that is because the way they're structured right now, the trade laws give corporations the right to tap into natural resources in the developing world, for example. And we want to see, what we want to frame water as is as a human right, as a shared legacy, as something that all of us have a right to. It's part of the commons. It's something for the common good. And this is an ancient concept. The Magna Carta had this concept, and it was even earlier than that. In the 500s, some emperor, I think it was Justinian, had this idea of a commons.
It was in Constantinople.
So,
he was in the East Roman Empire.
So we have to restore what our country understood when it was founded, and that is that if corporations do not function in ways that serve the common good, their charters should be revoked. And this idea is actually being put forward by the Network of Spiritual Progressives, and I'm a member of that group too, as a proposed constitutional amendment, along with no corporate personhood. That's also in that proposed amendment, which will be discussed in Washington this June. So that's where we're coming down. Is we're taking a stand. Water's a right, and it's not just a human right; it's a species right. That the animals and the fish and the plants have a right to water. That life is sacred, and that if that language is offensive, that we need to revere life. I think our native people have such a deep understanding of the sacredness of life and of the right relationship with it that we've lost in many ways in this culture, and that's one of the things we want to restore. There's a Native American elder, her name is Agnes Baker Pilgrim, and she does a water ceremony where she thanks the water. First she apologizes to it, and then she thanks it because we rely on it for our lives, and we've forgotten how to thank it, but we're going to remember in the future that we have to thank water for our lives.
I'm glad you brought her up, because we just acquired a video, I don't remember the name of it, but it's about the 13 grandmothers, and 7 generations, I think, is the name of them, getting from the side here. Seven generations.
It's 13 indigenous grandmothers.
Right, it's
That's what they are.
13grandmothers.org, something like that. But you can find that on the internet. And this particular woman, she was mentioned. I think is she the oldest or the eldest of these?
I don't know,
think she might have been. But you brought that up, and I was thinking as you were speaking that you're talking about human access to water and animal access to water. But it isn't just to a river or to a creek. That then you mentioned it earlier. It's a whole hydrological cycle. And the indigenous people, they don't just believe that there's water spirits. They believe that whole cycle is a living cycle.
They believe it's alive. And speaking of the hydrologic cycle,
I led right to you there.
A little picture for people.
We can get that to you there.
So that sounds kind of fancy, hydrologic cycle, but we see it every day. We experience it all the time. So I made this little mountain over here, and this mountain has a snow cap on it. And that snow cap, of course, it increases in the winter, and then it melts in the summer. So what the hydrologic cycle is going to refer to is it's going to refer to water in its different states and the transformation of water through seasonal temperature changes. Now, we're getting a real whammy because we got global climate change. We got global warming is the common term, but I prefer global climate change because it makes it easier for us to recognize that there are swings to the extreme, drier and wetter sometimes. Storms are bigger. This kind of change that when we have, like 2 years ago when we had all our snow, well, people were saying to me, I heard them in the health club, hey, they talk about global warming. There isn't any global warming. Look at all this snow. Well, we had more precipitation. So we had more snow. We had more precipitation because we had more evaporation from the ocean. So if you look at, you have your mountain over here, and then it melts, the snow cap melts, it forms streams and rivers, and then those rivers go into the ocean along with runoff from the land, and you get evaporation from the ocean and transpiration from the land, and that forms our clouds, and then you get precipitation. So with global climate change, we're expecting more coastal flooding. That's happening along the Oregon coast in the central and northern sections already. We're getting more river flow because of more precipitation in the winter. We're going to overflow. Some of our creeks and streams and rivers are going to overflow. And we're going to get less snow since, the period 1950 to 1995, the Cascade snowpack has declined by half. Yeah.
That's dramatic.
And we're going to get increased rain. And Oregon is in a very advantageous position when it comes to water supply, because we've got this gigantic aquifer underneath the high Cascades, and it has about 7 years worth of snow and rain, and that aquifer is going to continue to be replenished whether we have rain or snow. Mm-hmm. It's a porous glacial rock that is formed over the top of the aquifer, and it just absorbs rain and snow. So what that means is, although we've got really big rivers, and we've got a lot of rivers, and we've got great aquifers, we've got problems with our neighbors who are very thirsty to the south. Mm-hmm. And we also have a lot of pollution problems in our rivers.
Mm-hmm. You know, and every area has its own issues, where they have an abundance or a lack of water, and it's the multinational corporations are going into these places that have the water in order to bottle it up and bring it to other places that don't have it. And
right.
it's created the privatization of water has been really an issue around here. But I'm wondering, we talked about Bolivia. What are some of the consequences of the privatization in other countries? I know that India, the Coca-Cola went into taking some of the water in India and caused a lot of problem there.
Yeah, well,
so it isn't just here or here.
No.
It's pretty general.
Well, it's global, and the issues are different in every place in every country. But there are some commonalities. I mean, there are the soft drink companies. There's Coca-Cola and Pepsi in many countries. And in India, they've had a particularly difficult time in several areas where Coke has not only drawn down the water table from the amount of water they use to produce the product, but they've also polluted the water table because of the byproduct from the wastewater. So that has been a particular campaign, an international campaign, where women in particular have been very active in these areas of India, where Coke, a couple of areas in particular where Coke has been active. And they've stood vigil for years against Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola has had to close one plant, and there are fights going on around other plants. In this country, it's been mainly the actions have been centered around Nestle in a number of places in Maine, New Hampshire, Michigan, California, Oregon, Washington State. Nestle tried to go into 3 different locations along the Cascades, the Western Cascades in Washington State, and they each time were challenged by city council and citizen activists. There are also, of course, the privatization of public water services, so that's another issue. And
what exactly does that mean?
Well, what that means is, well, there's several ways that. One of the major ways that this occurs is where a municipality decides it's too expensive for them to keep running their own public water system, and they contract with a private corporation for operation and management. Mm-hmm. And that's public-private partnership, which then leads to many complications. Often the local workers are not continued, rates go up, quality of water goes down oftentimes. The call center is moved to some other distant location.
New Delhi.
And you don't have the transparency and the local control. In some instances, local private water systems have been bought up by multinationals, and the same issues occur that I just described. The movement in the U.S. is still sort of community by community. We haven't really built a people's movement in this country. I don't know how many of your listeners are aware that in South Africa, where there's been a lot of awareness built up about how prepaid water meters were a feature of privatization in South Africa outside of Johannesburg.
So you pay for the water before you get it.
You pay for the water before you can use it. So if you're down on your budget that month and you've spent it on medicine or school supplies or food, and you can't prepay your meter, you don't have water. In this country, we actually have that situation occur in this way. There are prepaid meters along the Mexican, Texas-Mexican border in poor Hispanic labor communities. But in Detroit, there was a crisis a number of years ago where 40 households had their water turned off because they were in arrears in their payments. Now, oftentimes you can negotiate for your payment over time. You can, work out something with the public water utility. But in this case, they did not allow for bargaining over how to pay the bill. They just shut them off entirely. And it was in the late fall and winter. Households were going without water. Children were being taken from households because the claim was made that they were abusing these children because they weren't able to supply them with water. Mm-hmm. It was a real crisis in Highland Park in central city Detroit. And the same thing had happened in Boston as well, where water meters have been turned off. Water access has been turned off because bills couldn't be paid. Mm-hmm. So we have these kind of comparable situations that exist in this country. But the media doesn't pick it up in this country very well. It's always a local fight. It's not part of the national water movement. Whereas the people's water movement is very well developed in most of those second and third world countries. Mm-hmm. So actually, as that people's movement has infused our movement in this country, and we're trying to build this now.
So you're up here for this water conference. Mm-hmm. Are you up here as a speaker or a panel or?
Well, tomorrow morning I'm speaking briefly about water as a human right and water as a right of nature, to sort of lay out some framing principles for the attendees to kind of take forward in the rest of the day's activities.
Mainly what you've been talking about here, probably, too.
Yeah.
Water is a right. Water is the species right. There was a fellow that was in town not too long ago, Eric Jimenez, speaking about water. He's a Food First.
Is he?
Executive producer of Food. And he talks about food as a human right.
Absolutely.
But I think food, shelter, all those, medicine, they all should be a human right because we're all united as human beings.
Right.
But the most obvious of those is water is a human right. It seems to me.
Let me just interject. So Cochabamba had its 10th anniversary this year, which was early in April, and then following that was the first People's Climate Summit and Rights of Mother Earth Summit, also in Cochabamba, in a small community outside of Cochabamba. About 22,000 people showed up. And one of the panels, there were 17 panels, one of the panels was on the concept of living well. So you mentioned how we need to sort of shift our way of living in harmony with each other and also sustainably within nature. So the Bolivians are setting forth this new kind of concept, I guess you could say, of living well. So not living beyond our means and beyond our material support system, that we have to kind of readjust. So instead of living better, which is what many of us think about, in bettering our lives, this is a concept of living well. And there's a wonderful statement about that. And so I think that's something we need to think about.
We should start in Las Vegas and Phoenix.
That's right.
Well, I'm wondering if living well isn't living better.
Yes, it is.
Because a lot of us,
right.
a lot of us have a collective sense of identity anyway.
Yeah.
We don't just think of ourselves. It's something that Archbishop Desmond Tutu said. What happens to one of us happens to all of us. A lot of us feel that in our guts.
That's true.
So it's one of the things I really loved about what you were saying, Nancy, is the people's movement. It was really broad-based coalitions,
right.
and it was made up of all sorts of folks, from union people to small business people to academics and religious folks. All kinds of people participated,
right.
and I think that's what we need to have in this country. I would like to pick up on another thing you said, which is the bottling issue.
Well, that had to come up here sooner or later.
Oh yeah. In Oregon,
taking the cap off the bottle.
Yeah, you did. The Pandora's bottle.
Yeah.
Well, right now in Oregon, we have Dasani, which is Coke's water spin-off. It's taking water from the Willamette, and we have Walmart, and that's taking bottled water from down near a spot east in Cove, Oregon. We have Oregon Rain in Newburgh, and we have H2 Oregon in or near the Dalles.
I had no idea.
And a lot of small companies too in various places. And what Nancy and I have talked about is how bottling adds carbon pollution to the atmosphere because it requires processing to make the bottles and then to put the water into the bottles. And then how, if you're going to transport them out of the area, of course, that's going to produce carbon pollution. And underlying this whole water crisis is the atmospheric crisis, the one that's being driven by greenhouse gases. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring up with bottles is the pollution from the bottles themselves. Plastic is really poison. And it's poison in two ways. If we recycle it, if we think we're really good kids and we go out and we recycle our bottles, we get pollution when we do the recycling. And one of the things Maud Barlow said, and she's a really famous water activist.
She was just in town recently.
Yeah, she's really great. She was at a University of Portland conference.
Canadians.org, I believe.
Yeah, Blue Gold. I've got Blue Gold with me.
Yeah.
But what she said is we've been sending a whole lot of our plastic to China. I'm not so sure they're accepting it anymore, and something like 80 to 90% of their groundwater is contaminated from various sources, including plastics recycling. So the other way that, let's say our bottles don't get recycled and they find their ways to dumps, or they find their ways into the ocean, which an incredible amount of plastic does. So much plastic. This blew me out of the water when I read a Sierra Club publication. An area 2 to 3 times the size of Texas is full of plastic debris. Now this debris doesn't just evaporate or break down into harmless substances. Unfortunately, it gets broken down into smaller and smaller bits. And those pieces of plastic, large or small, get ingested by sea life. And plastic concentrates pollution, like I read, like 1 million times more than the surrounding area, which has, some kind of pollutants in it. The plastic will be 1 million times more toxic. And that gets into our food supply. So food and water are directly connected. They're directly connected in many ways. And on the land, we see it with the ocean, the rivers and streams and so on. If they're polluted, we're killing our food supply too. And food, of course, is related to water with agriculture. So we have a complex system. And one of the things that we don't look at, every single thing that we do has an effect on the rest of the system. We're inside this incredible living thing, and it's got a myriad of connections, billions and billions of connections, and even the tiniest things in this incredible living system, like our phytoplankton in the ocean, or say our bees or our earthworms, or the soil bacteria, all matter to keeping the whole system alive, including us human beings. And right now, our pollution is such that the CO2 in particular causes ocean acidification, and the acidification is causing the kinds of marine life that need to have shells to survive. It's meaning those shells don't form properly, and that marine life can't survive. And that kind of marine life is often at the bottom of the food chain.
Food chain, right.
And yeah, so we're killing the food in the ocean, and we're causing the acidification. We're causing it's thought that global climate change is causing dead zones too in Oregon's ocean, unlike the rest of the world, where pollution is the driving factor. Strong winds and nutrient rising to the surface and warm waters, and anyway you get dead zones. So it's a complex system, and that's one of the things that I want to emphasize, is that everything we do has a consequence on that system. And if we can become more conscious of everything we do, it was one of the things that really helped me with Agnes Baker Pilgrim's water ceremony, where we drank the water after apologizing to it and thanking it, was I got more conscious of everything I do, and that involves water, and to approach it with love and tenderness, because it's such a precious resource. I think that's
It's
something.
life.
It's life.
It is
Absolutely.
life, not just for us, but for everything around us that that we're connected to.
You know, as you're speaking, there's like 15 different directions, you know, that we could go from what you were talking about. But the first thing I was thinking is it's not only what you were saying about the ocean, but it's also changing the pH, the acidity of it, and that is a real big situation too. And another issue is the fact that where does this plastic come from? Well, it comes from petroleum.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, you know, as long as we're needing plastic, we're going to be needing to drill 1, 5, 10 miles. I mean, I was just something on the radio about this is a mile deep, but there's other ones that are a lot deeper than that, and they're not talking about those.
Right.
And so, you know, the situation with petroleum is inextricably bound up with water and with food.
Absolutely. Well, you know, there's now a lot of talk about what the carbon footprint is of all that we produce and consume, and also what the water footprint is. So what is the water footprint of beef,
interesting.
producing beef or producing wheat, and so if we become much more conscious of both of those aspects, what's the energy component of the products we use and the services we use, then we can begin to make choices about one or the other, because we'll be conscious about the carbon footprint, the energy footprint, or the water footprint. So the more research is done on this, and the more kind of popular education, we can make choices to live well, which is living better on the earth and with each other, which is important. It's very important. I mean, we listen to the grandmothers talking about living well to the 7th generation, or respecting nature to the 7th generation. And so I think to come back to this conference, what I think is very ambitious and is going to be very productive, and actually mirrors what's going on in California at the moment too, is that tomorrow afternoon there will be breakout sessions on the 4 questions that are being asked about these different issues in the local area that Karen was referring to. She mentioned 2, I think, but there are 2 more. And after the breakout sessions, the spokespeople for each session will come back and present what the discussion concluded about the issue they were dealing with. And there'll be then a mediated discussion between the panelists, the representatives of the breakout sessions, and the audience to come to some conclusion about what parameters there might be proposed for the state water policy. So this process that Nancy Matella and David and the Alliance for Democracy have set forth for tomorrow mirrors to some extent the kind of consultative processes that have gone on in the countries, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, that have passed constitutions.
In the South.
Yeah, in the
Almost every
South, that have
time.
passed constitutions that recognize water as a human right and water and the rights of nature. So this is a real the beginning of a consultative process in Oregon about the state's strategic water policy. And I think it's really a wonderful opportunity.
Yes, we really want folks to come to that. I wanted to mention those breakout sessions really clearly. One of them is Nestle Waters and Microbrews. Where should the line be drawn regarding selling our water for profit?
I never considered microbrews, but they're really big. And
They're big,
they have
and
an
it
impact.
takes something like, is it 60 gallons to make 16 ounces of beer, something like that.
Oh.
It's
Well,
either,
they're 90, I think,
it's either 40
I
gallons,
think beer
wait
is
a minute.
95%
It's,
water.
well,
But-
the growing of the wheat.
Yes,
Takes-
there's the
takes-
water
or-
footprint.
Yeah, the water footprint. I had that. Anyway, check out
It's
Yes Magazine.
enormous anyway.
It's in here. It's big.
It's Yes.
But
Okay,
let's
let me
just-
go on with this. Wilsonville uses Willamette River water for its municipal drinking source. Why are other communities facing strong oppositions as their municipalities consider the Willamette as a drinking source?
And there'll be people watching right now that are in areas that
Absolutely.
that's
Right.
important.
That's right.
And I'd like to talk about river pollution and Willamette River in a minute. Portlanders get their water primarily from Bull Run, a watershed out of the area, yet some people are against taking water from the Columbia River and storing it in eastern Oregon, or against Californians piping Oregon water to their dry valleys. What's the difference in these scenarios? Should dedicated taxes or corporate ownership be used to support water infrastructure? So those are some pretty provocative topics if you really start looking at them.
Yeah.
And I wanted to look just for a moment at one of Oregon's disadvantages in water. We have a lot of pollution.
Yeah. Not unlike many other places, though.
No. We have some unique characteristics to our pollution, though.
Yeah.
Attorney General John Kroger said in a conference recently that every one of our 5 major rivers in Portland fails to meet federal Clean Water Act standards. And I've also read that a sample of about a quarter of our stream miles showed that 59% of our other rivers would fail also the federal Clean Water Act standards, at least one or more of them. So we need to look in particular because Portland sits at the junction of the Willamette and the Columbia, at the Columbia and at the Willamette River.
So what are the sources of this pollution?
Well, in the Willamette, there's a Superfund site in Portland Harbor.
Right here in downtown.
Right here in downtown.
I think farm runoff would have a lot, too.
Well, in that particular part of, yes, it does in general, but in that particular Superfund site, it's stuff like PCBs and dioxins and furans and all these weird and awful toxic chemicals.
Right.
And in the Columbia, we've got the Columbia running by the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. And we can't say enough bad things about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation.
We don't have enough time tonight.
No,
anyway.
we don't. There used to be 9 active reactors on the banks of the Columbia, and they were producing an atomic bomb for World War II. Now, what happens is that toxic stuff that came from those 9 reactors has slowly been leaching into the groundwater that goes into the Columbia, and that stuff includes uranium and technetium and strontium. And there are PCBs and trichloroethylenes, and in the center of the wonderful reservation is a lot of plutonium, which in over a long period of time, we're talking about the generations, let's look at, not just 7 generations, 70 generations, and 700 generations. That stuff is going to find its way into the river. Now, people over time, if things pan out the way we fear that they will, even in the short run, we're going to get more drying. People are going to want to tap into the Columbia, like folks in California. It's already been suggested, and that water source is not healthy. We want cleanup. Unfortunately, the U.S. Department of Energy wants to make the Hanford Reservation the target, the goal, the place to deposit the country's nuclear waste.
And mercury, too.
Yeah, all sorts of wonderful things. And they'll be trucking that nuclear waste
I thought it was also going to receive foreign nuclear waste, but not that. It's just U.S. waste.
Obama's policy is to receive, the nuclear weapons from other countries.
Right.
So that is going to up the ante, we believe, here locally. That it will probably up the ante for them to target all that waste into Hanford.
Well, then maybe California won't want that water.
Well, exactly, and it's going to, and that's tragic though, because it's going to, these trucks are going to be coming up highways from California and other places. They're going to be going up I-5 and I-84, and if they even are so much as idling in traffic, just that will cause something like 816 cancer deaths, and that's calibrated for males, not for women and children. Rapidly dividing cells in children, more dangerous for cancer with that. But so we have had a movement and there's leakage, and then there's the accidents. Forgot that. I don't want to forget this, and the potential for real terrorist bombs. All right. So we have had an active movement against that Hanford trucking for a long time.
Yeah.
Lines for Democracy has gotten involved in it. Columbia Riverkeeper has been involved.
Sure.
The state of Washington's been involved. Heart of America is terrific with Jerry Paulette. And we really
we need to fight back against Obama's approval of nuclear energy.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Not only approval, he's put billions on the table.
It's already
Exactly.
happening.
Yeah, so...
And most people say that it will take, 10 years for those plants to come online, at which point maybe we won't need as many as he thinks we need or he's approving of, because we will have, hopefully, renewables.
If he'd put that $70 billion or whatever for that nuclear reactor in Georgia or wherever it is, if he put that 70, 60 billion, whatever it is, into R&R on alternate energy, renewables, we wouldn't need them. It wouldn't need them at all.
I know.
And this collaborative process you're talking about, which is part of this conference tomorrow, that seems to me probably the most important part of the Commons. Is the collaboration of people, which is what they used to do. They used to gather and talk. Now they don't gather and talk.
No.
And that's why these conferences are so very important. And we can get that graphic up in a second, let folks know a little bit more about it. But is this collaborative process, work going at all down there in California?
Well, it's
Where you
happening.
from?
Yes, it's happening in California because there are lots of issues in California.
Because you have such a great population down there.
Well, the population. We also have terrible water contamination in the Central Valley from agricultural runoff and dairy runoff. So we have nitrates, and there are hundreds of communities that don't have access to safe drinking water. So a couple of years ago, a large number of organizations came together to form something called the California Water Summit, which is made up of some religious, tribal, policy, environmental, social and environmental justice groups, to really begin to build a sort of people's water movement in the state. And so they've crafted out of those various meetings over a couple of years a statement of a preamble and a statement of of principles. And so you may have heard that we have this $11 billion bond, water bond, that Schwarzenegger and many in the state legislature have approved to go on the ballot in November, which is to build vastly improve and build, well, I wouldn't say improve, but vastly expand the water infrastructure in California. It's being fought tooth and nail by many of us who feel it's a huge expense. By the time this $11 billion bond is the interest is paid on that, becomes a $20 billion bond after the 30 years. So the principal plus the interest. And it favors big business, big corporate solutions, dams, and it doesn't really look at the overall social justice, environmental justice, and water democracy issues. So the statement of principles are an alternative view of water policy in California, and it is based on this principle of collaboration among groups and people, working with state representatives. And so far, there still is a very antagonistic relationship, and we don't seem to be making much progress on the real sit-down collaborative aspect, which we all hope will happen. We have to defeat this bond first. And then there's some other issues around the delta and the water, how water is going to be transported around the Sacramento River Bay Area delta to go from north to south. How much will be shipped south, is sent through the California Canal south, whether we need a new canal that will take water around, how that affects the ecology of the delta and the fish. The whole Sacramento Bay Area delta there is really in a state of ecological collapse, and the sort of the fish are in crisis. And but we haven't really gotten to it. We've gotten to a point of establishing principles, but we haven't gotten to a point where everybody's sort of in a room saying, well, what are we really going to do and how are we going to do this, recognizing certain core values, certain core principles. And
profit not being the main one.
No. But last year we did run a Water as a Human Right bill, and it got through both state legislatures. It got to the governor's desk, and then he vetoed it. But it was a bill stating that there should be sufficient safe and affordable water for all in California.
Can you do that as an initiative process?
We could probably take it around as an initiative process, but that takes a huge amount of
Yes, it does.
money and organization.
Yeah.
And then you know what happens in California when everybody dumps money in the other side. And
Right.
so I wouldn't want to do it that way.
But what you're saying about water democracy and environmental justice, that cuts to the heart of the whole issue.
does.
Because what we're talking about in India is poor people, Bolivia is poor
Right,
people,
right.
and there's been a lot of talk. I've even seen it on, I think it was Tom Hartman was speaking about how America's gone from a creditor to a debtor nation, gone from a manufacturer to bringing most of its products in, which puts us in many ways on a level with third world nations.
Yeah,
And so
well,
some of those issues that have been happening there
Yeah.
are going to be happening
Yeah.
here.
Well, I want to make an analogy here because you brought this up, which is the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary and the World Bank, and the trade agreements forced privatization on many countries. They said, we'll give you the loans, but you have to privatize your public services, your education, your transportation.
And your resources.
And resources and your water services. To get these loans, you need to privatize because then you can spend the money on imports. You won't be funding those public services, so you can use those monies to develop your export economy. So you have
your infrastructures. Yeah.
well, you have income to buy our exports. Our economic collapse, the Wall Street debacle, has been the same kind of structural adjustment that we've demanded of third world countries, that they structurally adjust their budgets. So while we will loan them money, they have to privatize their public services. What's happened in this country is, with the budget crises, and municipalities can't fund their public services. So for example, Akron, Ohio, 2 years ago, the mayor decided he would lease out for 90 years the public water service to a private corporation. For 90 years, he would take that lump sum and invest it in, I suppose, the stock market or bonds or whatever. Of course, that would be a silly idea in this economy, but
Right.
anyway, that's what he was going to do. And because municipalities are underfunded now. So this is the kind of, Wall Street has produced the kind of structural adjustment that the IMF, the World Bank, and the trade agreements did in third world countries.
Interesting.
Because now
I see the connection very clearly.
now our states and municipalities are flat broke. So they're cutting services. What they can't provide publicly, then private contractors come in and do. And if you can afford that, mental health, privately delivered, not publicly delivered, you'll have the mental health or the health care or whatever else. But that's the kind of structural adjustment that's going on in this country that we don't really talk about in those terms, that third world countries have suffered.
I'm sure glad you brought that up.
So we need to really see that this is a kind of global economic system that we're fighting against that takes different, it's produced in different ways, but it's part of the same global hyper-capitalist kind of corporate system we're in.
It's not just like a corporation will come in to cascade locks and promise a few jobs because of the area is needing jobs. It's much larger. The whole system is under that same type of predatory assault.
Yeah. So in fact, well, you mentioned the jobs. In fact, when we were working with in McLeod in Northern California, where Nestle was.
That's where I'm from, right down
Are
in
you
there.
really?
Yeah,
Yes.
Mount Shasta
Yeah.
weed area.
Well, Nestle can't promise that those jobs will all be local jobs because that, in fact, is discrimination. They can't say we're only going to hire locally because they could be charged as discriminating against any other part of the labor pool. So there are other ways to foster economic development in a community that actually surveys the skills and the intellectual capital of a community and then produces a plan for economic development that will really produce the employment that all those people would like to have, productive employment.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you don't have to take what's just offered you.
Right.
Yeah, it seems to me that
Let's get the phone number up.
It seems to me that
You think we've generated enough questions?
I think we have. Well, we've had a great conversation. We could just go on because this is just never ending in what the issues we're talking about. We can get the phone number up, get a comment or two, or get a question.
Yeah, that issue of jobs, though, that's just one more way that the whole financial system pits us against one another.
Yes, it does.
And our interests against one another. Because in the Cascade Locks example you were talking about, Jim, where I think there's maybe 40 jobs involved, and it looks like they make it seem as if, oh my gosh, they're going to employ everybody in the region, and it's the way that we need to work together for the common good, to bring that theme back in.
Yes.
That Eleanor Ostrom writes about working together.
She's
and
a great
you know,
economist.
in the old days, yeah, right, she got a Nobel Prize
Right.
because finally she said, hey, there's something else going on here. There's cooperation, not just competition. And we've got to draw on our strengths in cooperating. And I think that, you know, unlike situations that they would usually talk about as cooperative, where you have homogeneous populations and you have homogeneity and economic status and so on, I think that we are cutting across lines more and more, racial and ethnic and religious and even socioeconomic status lines, because we're down to the wire now. These are real life and death situations, whether it's in the Gulf with the horrible toxic oil spill, or whether it's in our water crisis
Well, I
that's
think too
developing
much
in the
we
country.
depend on our elected representatives. We depend on them to represent us instead of collectively coming together and then really advocating strongly in a collective way rather than just a highly partisan or highly ideological way.
Sure.
But as a result of the kind of collaborative work that tomorrow might result, you know.
But let's not count them out totally, because, for instance, I asked through a moderator, John Kitzhaber, whether he was in favor of further privatizing, commodifying, exporting, or trading Oregon for commercial purposes, Oregon's water supply, and he said he was against it. So
Very
did
good.
Bill Bradbury, who was the
Very
other
good.
Democratic candidate in the primary. And right now, the no further privatization is part of the Oregon Democratic Party's platform.
Excellent.
Because I put it there,
Yes,
and
you
along
played a
with
big role in that.
along with a bunch of other folks who voted for it. You know, maybe 200 other folks. Consciousness is rising around these issues.
That's optimistic. We have a call, Maddie. You have a couple calls here, so we'll get the first caller up on the air here.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I switched on the TV and I noticed that all of you were talking about a lot of the financial problems that are going on and some of the people who are behind these problems. And I wanted to ask, have you ever read the book by John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic
Oh, yeah.
Hitman?
Oh, yes.
You've read it?
I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with it. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't read the whole book, no,
Okay,
but I'm
yeah.
familiar with his arguments.
Yeah, Confessions
So
of
am I.
an Economic
Yeah.
Hitman talks all about that kind of thing.
Yeah,
the
he does.
the coyote that goes in after, if they can't convince someone, a country, to act against its best interests or the best interests of the commons, how then they send the
Troops in.
the
troops.
forceful,
The
yeah,
economic troops in.
yes,
Yeah.
And then if they fail, then they send the actual
That's-
soldiers in.
That's
Yeah.
right.
No,
All
you're
right.
absolutely right.
Well, thanks for bringing that up.
Yep.
I think we have another caller right behind them. We've got like 5 minutes left, so we'll take a couple brief calls, and then we'll try to sum this up and make sure we mention the water conference that's going on again as well. Next caller.
Yes, I was calling about the water.
Right, we are. We just got a couple minutes here.
Okay.
You have a comment or question?
Question.
Sure. Hello? Oh, I guess you just want to make sure she knew what we were talking about.
she got it right.
She got it right. That's right. We'll bring that up in case we run out of time here. That there is a water conference tomorrow, and it's taking place at the First Unitarian Church from 10 o'clock in the morning.
No, it starts at 9:30.
Oh, what I saw
Yeah.
on the website, I saw 10. So okay,
Well,
9:30.
it says here 9:30.
Yeah, and that's at Southwest 12th and Salmon for folks that don't know, and it's free. wanted to really emphasize that, and we really would love folks to show up so they can be part of formulating the state's first strategic water plan.
It isn't just going to be people there talking at people.
No.
It's going to be a collaborative process.
No, it's meant to really engage people.
And it seemed to me, you know, we talked about policy issues here written down in front of me, and then there's supposed to be some policy makers there that can absorb some of this information.
Oh yes, Jefferson Smith will be there. Let me see, who else is going to be there? Lynette De Silva, who's director of the program in water conflict management at OSU. That's Christine Svekovich, DEQ Senior Water Quality Policy
But there will
Analyst.
be people there that
So there are going to be people there who can answer questions and help inform the discussion.
And take some of the information back into the process.
I think we just got another call. We'll get another caller up. Next caller.
Yes, good evening. It's an interesting program.
All right, we got about a minute or two here, so.
Yes, very well. The water is extremely important, but underlying all these generic or universal problems, there is one that is rarely discussed. The population of the planet increases by 3 units per second. There are 3 more people in the world every second. Any effort that seems to be made, which is very worthwhile making, seems to pale in consideration with the enormous number of people for which it is reasonable and human to provide food and decent water. How this can be resolved, I don't know, but I think it should be brought up in some fashion. Thank you. And good.
All right.
Yeah, about 2 billion people, it's projected by the World Health Organization, are going to be without water in this next generation. So I agree with the caller that stabilizing and reducing population in a way that's kind and gentle and by choice, rather than
By choice is the word, because it's going to stabilize itself one way or the other.
rather than by the horrible as a horrible consequence of insufficient food and water is the way to go. And the way to go is also empowering women. If we empower women, it politically and economically, the birth rate drops, and that's been shown over and over again.
Well, he brings up a good point, and and the thing that you're talking about is those populations, as the water becomes scarce, are going to move to areas, which we mentioned before, that has water.
Right.
And it's great that here in Oregon we're moving. You were saying there was a move to determine some kind of water democracy, but it was after so many problems have already been happening over the years, and then here we're trying to get ahead of the curve.
That's right.
Well, when Uruguay in, I think it was 2004, passed their constitution that establishes water as a human right and that water must remain public, they also have in that constitution that they will share water outside of the country upon discussion and a consultative process. So I think that this gets us back to if you're going to share water cross borders or cross state or country borders, then the country you're sharing with needs to demonstrate that they've done all they can do to meet their water needs, conserve, have sustainable water management systems, etc. So this has to be a cooperative process, otherwise we're just not going to survive.
Right, you can't just ship water to a country that is living, all their cities live in a desert or whatever. So, So,
Well, and they've got fountains going all over the place. It's sort of like Las Vegas writ large.
So, we're down to 30 seconds. Thank you for the program.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciated it.
All right, I think we've
nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you as well, and then one of the greatest parts of